It's Game Boy World, and we've been Shanghaied again. I promised back in the Matchmania episode that we'd be seeing another Shanghai-inspired puzzler again soon, and here we go, barely a dozen episodes later. Shanghai, Sichuan, Hong Kong. Basically, if you find a Game Boy cart named for a chunk of Chinese geography, you can guess it's probably going to involve matching mahjong tiles. And so it is with Hong Kong. Incidentally, that title made this episode an enormous pain in the ass to research, because looking up Game Boy Hong Kong leads to endless lists of pirate and bootleg games out of Hong Kong. This is no bootleg though, and it's very definitely from Japan. As a matter of fact, it has one of the more interesting origin stories in recent Game Boy world memory. Hong Kong came into the world, or at least into Japan, courtesy of Japanese magazine publisher Tokuma Shoten. What's a magazine publisher doing producing video games, you may wonder? But as a company with a fairly heavy focus on the youth market, Tokuma Shoten's involvement made sense. One of Tokuma Shoten's more successful business ventures in the late 80s turned out to be its Famicom computer magazine, aka Famimaga. A direct competitor to the venerable Famicom Tsushin, or Famitsu, Famimaga was pretty much what you'd expect for a games magazine of the era. Hyperactive layouts, photographic screen grabs scattered willy-nilly about the page, tips, previews, reviews, reader polls, and even occasional hints of meaty material like developer interviews. Tokuma Shoten's Famimaga line lasted throughout the 90s, eventually spawning the likes of Famimaga 64. However, for a very short while, at the beginning of the decade, the company's game magazine line crossed over into actual games. Perhaps taking a cue from the diskettes that you often found glued to the front of Spectrum-centric magazines in the UK and American PC magazines, Tokuma Shoten began distributing games with Famimaga. But wait, you might say in puzzlement, wasn't Famimaga focused specifically on consoles, on the Famicom? How could it distribute games? Famicom carts don't come that cheap. And it's true, they didn't. However, in Japan, Nintendo fans had a second format option that came far more cheaply than carts, the Famicom Disk System. Specifically engineered to be inexpensive, the disk system even offered players an option to buy cheap rewritable blank diskettes and temporarily save games to them via in-store kiosks. The format had reached the end of its life, beleaguered by piracy and obsolescence, so blank discs must have cost a little bit of nothing. And so Tokuma Shoten decided to add some sex appeal to Famimaga by including free pack-in disk system games. Not just any games either, but rather games specifically created for this purpose. Ultimately, the publisher put out 6 of these discs in total, and these now somewhat uncommon discs are the only way to actually play those 6 Famicom titles, at least legally. Not that anyone but collectors really care, the Famimaga Disk System series consisted of a bunch of mundane properties that never really went much of anywhere. The one exception being Famimaga Disk Volume 5, which contained the debut of Compile's long-running Puyo Puyo series and is therefore something of a notable release, especially for Sega fans. Otherwise, though, the Famimaga Disk series has vanished unknown and unloved into history. But the very first release in the line managed to make at least a little bit of noise before vanishing. It's the game that appeared here on Game Boy about half a year after its March 1990 debut as a free disk system giveaway, Hong Kong. Aside from the smaller screen dimensions and lack of color, Hong Kong for Game Boy appears to be almost entirely identical to Famimaga Disk Volume 1 Hong Kong. The game looked pretty basic to begin with, so the change of format did it no real harm. Again, Hong Kong involves a big stack of mahjong tiles. This time they're not piled up in the third dimension, but rather arranged flat, in a brick layer pattern, so that each tile is centered within the border of the 2 tiles above it and the 2 tiles below it. Unlike other games we've seen named for Chinese territories, though, Hong Kong only makes use of 6 tiles in total from the larger mahjong set. These 2 details, the overlapping arrangement of tile edges and the 6-tile limit, form the backbone of the gameplay. Play in Hong Kong consists simply of matching a tile from the playfield to the current draw. Unlike in Shanghai, you don't have to take tiles only from the edges. You can play any match you see on the screen, regardless of how many tiles surround the one you select. There is a complication, however. You can only play a tile if it won't leave a piece above it hanging, so to speak. If at any point you cause any tile on the field to no longer have another playing piece touching its bottom edge, the game ends and you lose. The challenge then becomes to clear the entire screen without leaving any invalid pieces. This can range from simple to impossible because Hong Kong offers a mind-boggling degree of variety in its boards. Not only can you choose from one of 10 different layout shapes for your tile arrangements, you can also define the seed variables for the pattern in which tiles are placed. There are tens of thousands of different boards possible, and while one has to assume that some of these would prove to be unwinnable, it also means you have to play for a long time before you had to repeat a particular layout. To make things a little less daunting, the game does make one concession. The sequence in which the match tiles appear runs on an unchanging cycle, so you can plan ahead many moves if you're the strategic type. Actually, clearing a board usually isn't too difficult, but you get more points for taking a piece surrounded by other tiles, which of course creates a greater risk that you'll run out of moves and end up being forced to remove a key tile that leaves another tile hanging and therefore losing. So there is a risk-reward here. But there's really not much more to Hong Kong than that. It's a simple but different take on Shanghai. It's reasonably addictive and offers as much replayability as you could possibly hope for. Hong Kong's Game Boy developer is credited as Onion Software, a company that apparently only existed long enough to produce this single Game Boy adaptation of a freebie disk system game. Much as with the game itself, Onion Software appears to have vanished to the ages. In the end, nothing about Hong Kong as a game particularly stands out from the ocean of similar tile-matching Game Boy releases we've seen so far. But hey, at least it has an interesting backstory, right?
Making your way in the world today takes everything you've got.
Next on Game Boy World, another ancient PC classic tries to make its way in the world today, the world of handheld gaming. Cheers to that.
To get away.